father would say, "That's enough, hurry it up." Hurry it up. Well, who can follow Laura Swiderski? Well, she's still talking. Okay. Let me put my glasses on so I can see what I'm doing. Yay. I can't. Okay. Well, I'm honored to be here today and to tell you about my Perrucci family story. Oh, hi there. Hello. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm honored to be here today and to tell you about my Perrucci family story. As I stepped to the podium this morning, I looked at the World War II monument behind you. My father, Thomas Perrucci, chaired the committee that built that monument. One day in the mid-90s, shortly after the monument was finished, he began reciting the names of the young men he knew who had lost their lives in World War II, and he started crying. History was very personal to him. And coming here this morning, I went to that monument and I looked at the names. There are 5 young men: Louis Cecchio, Capone, D'Adamio. But there's a 4th name that I forget now, but the one that made him stop was Anthony C. Perrucci, who was, I later learned, let me get this straight, the grandson of my grandfather's first cousin, who helped him get the property where our house was built on Stout Avenue. We are all connected. As I stand here this morning, I can now appreciate my father's tears. When I lived in Scotch Plains, in the house that my grandfather Concezio built facing the Watchung Mountains, I often thought about him walking up Bonnie Burn Road in the mornings, in the dark, to his job, digging track for Central Jersey Railroad. He is the inspiration for the book I'm writing, Searching for Concezio. And this morning, I hope the true story I learned about him will help you see that we all are part of the story of America, regardless of how small a part we play. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Am I yelling? I hope not. I grew up listening to my father tell a story about my grandfather's struggles to succeed in America. It was a hard story to listen to. Concezio did not find streets paved with gold when he arrived on June 8th, 1913. My grandfather had served in the Italian cavalry, and he could read and write English too. But when he arrived in America, the only job he could get, like most immigrants, was digging track for the railroad for $1 a day. He worked 2 jobs for the railroad, and after hours and on Saturdays for his brothers-in-law, Donato DeQualo, Luigi Sangiuliano, and Mauro Moretti, who had started a business producing pilings. They bought a tract of land in the Watchung Mountains, and they started doing that. And the business unfortunately shut down, I guess, after the Great Depression. He did that on the 6th day, and on the 7th he didn't rest. He built the house where I grew up with my 6 siblings, 4 of whom are here today. It took him 5 years to finish because he paid for the materials as he earned the money. Laura just explained that. Banks didn't like lending money to immigrants whom they considered temporary workers. And they got their houses built. It took my grandfather 5 years because that's how houses got built. But they also helped each other. I would imagine that several of the houses on the north side of town here, my grandfather built the foundation for, because that was was one of the things he could do. He could break foundation. So my grandfather got sick, though, with Parkinson's disease before his 40th birthday, and he had to stop working. He lived a very hard life, an unsuccessful life, most people would say. Over the years, editors told me that no publisher would be interested in my book. My grandfather wasn't famous. He hadn't achieved extraordinary success. For many years, that's what I thought too. But there was something about my father's story that compelled me to start taking notes after I graduated from college. It was hard to find information, even with the experience and the training I had. Until very recently, immigrants did not study immigration history, and immigrants certainly didn't have the time to sit around writing letters and recording their thoughts in diaries. They were too busy working. They were working all the time. During the years of mass migration from 1880 to 1920, most immigrants arrived with a suitcase or a bundle of their belongings in one hand and the name and an address of a relative in the other. All I had to rely on were my grandfather's arrival papers, the deed to the house, his citizenship papers, the framed portrait of him in his military uniform that hung in the dining room of our house for as long as I can remember, and my father's story, which my father never finished. I collected information for many years. In 1974, I visited Mondozzoli, the small, isolated village in rugged Abruzzo of Italy. I met my grandfather's last surviving sister, great-aunt Erminia, reviewed the interviews I did in 2002 with Laura Cecchio, a great niece of my grandfather's, and Guido Bertucci, my father's lifelong friend who boarded in our house. And in between, I read about immigration history and the politics and economics of Italy. I also kept uncovering new information. You know, with a fascinating story, sometimes you just can't stop. 2016, I read that Ellis Island was adding immigration records to the database. I checked and found my grandfather's name a second time. Oh my gosh, he had arrived in 1906. What did that mean? I traced research here and there, and I found out that he was what was known as a bird of passage, someone who thought he was going to, beautiful words in Italian, uccello di passaggio, a temporary worker who intended to fly back home to Italy after he found those streets paved with gold. He came for the first time in 1906. I did the math. He was 16 years old, just a teenager. I was still working. I was always working and too busy to write my book, but the truth was my research wouldn't be complete until I dug into my father's story, which I found so painful to listen to. After my grandfather got sick, my grandmother Rachel became the family breadwinner. She and Concezio continued to live in rooms they rented on Cook Avenue, where my father Thomas and his sisters Rose and Josephine were born, while my grandfather continued to build their house on Stout Avenue. To pay their bills, my grandmother cooked and cleaned for 6 or more boarders at a time in the house my grandfather had attended for his own family. I often thought about my grandmother when I walked up the stairs to the second floor of the house and their bedroom came into view. She cleaned that bedroom every day, but not for herself and her husband. She cleaned that bedroom for the boarders who made it possible for their family to survive during the Great Depression. And she did that work day in and day out for 17 years, until the Christmas of 1945. My father asked for an honorable discharge from the U.S. Army Air Force and came home. Instead of heading to college to study the law on the GI Bill, he picked up a paintbrush and began painting houses to support his family. He was 20 years old. What my family had endured stunned me, and I began to see what all the information I had been collecting added up to. Sacrifice, courage, honor, devotion, loyalty. Sorry. Those qualities defined the first and second generations of my family, and I'm sure they defined the first and second generations of your family too. They also showed me a story worth telling, a larger story, a story that reflects the stories of all your families and the untold stories of the millions of young men like my grandfather who came to this country. But I still didn't begin writing. Why not? I don't know. But I still didn't begin writing until my mother gave me a push one day. My mother, Beatrice, was not Italian American. Her parents and grandparents were German and French Canadian. She was very shy, but she had the courage to marry into an immigrant family with a sick father-in-law, a mother-in-law who would not learn to speak English, and a sister-in-law, Aunt Rose, who died a few months after they met. There was just something about him, she would often say about my father, and she would laugh, but she wouldn't explain. It took me a few years to figure it out, and what I figured out is his loyalty to family spoke volumes to her. So one day, I walked into her bedroom to begin clearing out her dresser after she died. In one drawer, my hand touched a pile of small black and white photographs, you know, those ones from the 50s, 2-3 inches. When I opened the top drawer, I spread them out on the bed to study, and I saw for the first time 2 photographs of my grandfather Concezio that I had never seen before. In one, he sits in the kitchen and looks like a sick old man as he bends over his cane. But in the other, he is standing up straight next to me and my mother, who's holding me in her arms in the backyard of the house he built, and his cane is nowhere in sight. I held the photographs in both of my hands to study and asked myself, what am I looking at? And then it hit me. My grandfather didn't want me to remember him as a sick old man. He was a success. He had built this beautiful, he was a success. That's what I realized that day. He was an extraordinary success. My grandfather lived with Parkinson's for 24 years after he got sick with Parkinson's. The drug levodopa, which treats this degenerative neurological condition, did not become available until 1975. How did he do that? He did that with the support of his Italian community. Every day, Guido had told me, a group of Italian men, which likely included his brothers-in-law, Donato De Qualo, Luigi San Giuliano, and Mauro Moretti, and others, came over and would help him walk. By the time he died, on December 8th, 1953, he saw 3 of his 7 grandchildren take their first steps in America in the beautiful house he built at 408 Stout Avenue, where 3 generations of my family lived, with its chestnut wood, and later with the additions my father made, the marble and the wrought iron from Papa Nick, the legendary iron worker here, and its soaring ceilings. But he had built a far more beautiful house than the one I believe inspired him, the castle of Mount Ansoli in Mondozzoli, the castle he looked up to from those dusty streets. Why was it a beautiful house, far more beautiful, the one that he built with my grandmother Rachel? Because he handed me and my 6 siblings a future they could only imagine. Sacrifice, courage, honor, devotion, loyalty. Those are the things to remember this Columbus Day weekend. I hope that you will write your family stories too, and tell your stories to your children and grandchildren. It's important. It's really important. Thank you.